Eric's.
Omar.
I have to note something. We need to reveal a little bit of the mystery of the cult, okay? It's not going to quite be like the Wizard of Oz where we see what's behind the curtain, but times be tough for evidence-based practitioners. And some people have noted that Helms's couch, if you go on our YouTube video, if you color correct, so color grading, because I have, incandescent light bulbs above me, so it has kind of a yellowish hue, changing the color of the futon to my left, but it's actually the same, shape and general structure and color as Eric's couch. Eric, do you want to answer the question of whether or not we're in the same room just because, let's face it, it's financial reasons. We could tell people otherwise, but do you want to answer it?
The first thing I want to say is, can I get a high five?
Oh, yeah, no problem. Yeah, you're that clap. You're that connection.
Yeah, and I just want to say big ups to Brandon for clearly editing out any echoes that we have. And it's funny how the incandescent bulb right here only really kind of affects that area, but then my lighting affects this area a little different. Yeah, right. It is the angle.
There's a window.
And bodybuilding is illusions. It's all angles, baby. Yeah.
I will say what's even more fantastic, Trexler's here with us in the same room, but he has the green screen backdrop. What backdrop, Trex, did you download for this episode?
It's called Zen Magic. That's
Zen Magic 1.0. Are there different permutations, or is it just called like Zen Magic?
No, it's just when you open the software, it's the first one.
Okay. So you didn't choose it. It's like the default background.
Correct. Yeah.
Something poetic about that. Well, can I say it feels fantastic to have the Triumvirate back in the full swing of things. Helms was doing some traveling. You will be seeing some fantastic content being dripped out, I believe, on the RP channel over the next year. We want to give also a shout out. We said this before, myself and Trex, because we had that duo episode to Mass Monthly Application Strength Sports, because in the last episode, Trex, we were talking all about protein and how, big protein is out to get you. And it felt right to do that episode with you, just because, some people, not to get into anyone, may or may not be compromised by, companies, by research they did, masters they've done on protein. So I don't know if we could say this, Trex, but it felt like the first unbiased episode as it relates to protein and protein research.
Yeah, what you find in the research world is sometimes people will put together some crappy hypothesis in 2014, and they will kind of defend it to the death, even though it's completely debunked and wasn't really that great in the first place. And so a lot of researchers, of course, you have to check their financial conflict of interest, but then you have to check their just like flat out ego conflict of interest of kind of saying, no, I can't admit that I was wrong in 2014, and they'll just kind of fight you to the death.
Yeah, and if that person is, let's say, on the science board of a supplement company, like Element Formulations, I mean, that's just another conflict of interest. We don't have to bring up my position, Helms. Don't give me that look. But I will say that on a far less contentious topic, Helms, I'm so glad you're back. I want to read to you the review, because we recorded, Trex and myself, before we get into this monster episode, and that's a capital M, okay? In fact, the whole word is capitalized. Forget it, okay? It's not just a capital M monster. The whole thing is monster episode. But we recorded it 2 days ago, so the episode technically has not been released on platforms, so you haven't had a chance to listen to it. But the latest review, it's 5 stars. I wanted to read it with Trex because I was curious how you'd react. But you're going to see exactly what I mean when I say that. I want to give you the opportunity. Okay, we don't communicate directly with our audience because we're top, obviously, the pyramid, but we communicate with each other about what they say. And so we have to include you in this conversation. So, Helms, I'm going to read the review. I want you to react, and then we will segue as we segue at the 10-minute mark into the actual topic. Okay, so to read what we read last week. 5 stars. I want to say it's a 5-star review, so everyone just breathe. Be very comfortable. Apple iTunes, that's where people leave reviews. Go ahead, leave one. 2 out of 3 of the hosts are fantastic, okay? Eric and Omar are fantastic hosts. When Eric speaks, on the other hand, I have to check if my ears are bleeding. Regardless, the science podcasts are informative and meet listeners at any level of education. I have learned so much and developed such an appreciation of research from this podcast and others. Next year, I'm going to grad school in the fall to get my MPH in health behavior, and I will keep in mind the skepticism with compassion and the expertise with humility. So, lovely review. There was just a little bit at the start that was kind of perplexing, and Trexler had his take, of course. I can't discern between the Erics when they refer to, first name Eric, but the individual said, Eric and Omar are fantastic hosts. When Eric speaks, on the other hand, I have to check if my ears are bleeding. Helms, your reaction?
The part I noticed was "and other podcasts." And once again, I feel like this is a one-star review that's in disguise. This is a wolf in sheep's clothing. It was a red herring trying to divide us by pointing out that when one of the Erics speaks, it makes the ears bleed. I get what they're trying to do. They're trying to drive wedges that already exist and to make them wider while we're trying to come together. This is just like the information apparatus in, certain states, because I'm not trying to get the bots to show up in our comments, that have tried to create polarization in other countries. You know what I'm saying? There's geopolitics involved here. So the United States of Eric will not be divided. We've experienced prior civil wars when the prior podcast will not be named, existed with someone else named Eric on it. And that was a devastating time for everyone. And I think we'll probably have some 12-hour docuseries on the History Channel in the future that goes into the travesties and tragedies that came out of that. But I'm not going to let some type of foreign influence do that. But I will point out that you can tell this is a pseudo 5-star review, something in disguise based upon that and other podcasts comment. That's the indicator. And the first one is just simply I would say a rough shot attempt at driving wedges where a wedge will not fit because we stand united.
Trex, your reaction, and then we'll segue. Thank you, Alex.
Yeah, well, when I gave my initial reaction, I wasn't up to speed on that whole United Front thing. So you might want to listen to it later, Helms. But I'm glad that you're united with me. I'm just not sure if it works in both directions.
Well, Trextopia is just on that rise. So it's like when power asymmetries do exist, right, you get to select whom you work with. And so it's quite clear where the Trex army is and how necessary they are to be at the forefront of said battle. So it's a necessary union. I do want to throw this out there. I want another negative Omar review, okay? I read them in the past. I'm tired of this shit. This Eric stuff. And then the other review that said like the podcast is too verbose and like you guys were joking, it's after the Duo episode of Metabolic Adaptation, which as I said in the last episode, and I stand by this, that was a top 10 episode of the last year, like on a personal level. And I like to think being one of the hosts of the Iron Call, like all of us being hosts of this podcast, that we know deep down in the cookies of our souls what not only the Iron Cult needs, but what personally is necessary for the podcast to have. And so that was truly a monster episode. And that's why this one today, we will segue. We're not even at the 10-minute mark. My gosh. But we're talking about something that was implied in the last episode, Trex, where you're talking kind of about longitudinal studies, ecological validity. We're talking also about acute mechanistic research. So maybe kind of reviewing the evidence hierarchy, but maybe more in particular, the evidence hierarchy for consumers. And then the question that was maybe built inside some of the stuff being discussed in the previous episode, which you don't necessarily need to listen to in order to listen to this episode, but it might help, would be the research chain and when it could or should be broken. Helms, I have a question for you. So as someone, I put myself on the consumer side for the evidence hierarchy. Here's generally what I think. You could look at position stands and so forth, and maybe that should be what you should be following. Okay. Personally, I kind of buy things like mass monthly application of strength sports and other things like Weightology, Shadow James Krieger. I'll buy them. I won't necessarily open them up, guys, but I have them. Okay. So I've actually been a subscriber since the inception. And moreover, because I'm just plugged in on that social media, I'll actually look at the photo, to be honest, that's posted first, and I'll try and infer what the subject is about and what the conclusions are when mass posts on Instagram. And then if I have enough time or care, which is not often, I'll read the 1 or 2 sentence at the top of the Instagram post, and then I'm good. And usually it's not even a summary, it's more a statement like, hey, new mass issue has dropped, and I'm good. I just know there's someone out there fighting the good fight. So maybe, Trex, quick reaction to that. Then Helms, I want you to set up this episode because this one, you brought up this topic. It's a fantastic idea, man.
Well, you can always trust me. And so if it's published in mass, that's essentially fact at that point. And if you just skim every month when we put out that post on Instagram saying, hey, the new issue's out, most of them have a picture. And so like the first one, if you look at it and there's like a piece of salmon and like 2 eggs and then like a cut of beef, you say, oh, protein, so you can mostly piece together the literature by scanning that monthly Instagram post.
Well, that's what I ate that day. I assumed that was like a food recommendation guideline. So I just got a piece of salmon, 2 eggs, little steak. Now, I assumed it was like a full day of eating, kind of like not vlog or not, but like just, a report. Helms.
No, I think it is really for the people who are at a stage in their career where they have a day dedicated to continuing education where they might actually say, not necessarily read the article, but open the PDF issue and then quickly click on each one of the articles because it jumps to it so they can read the key points. That process, reading the key points of about 8 articles and 1 video, will probably take most literate people about 7 minutes. And let's be honest, in this grind culture, 7 minutes is all you have on your continuing education day. Because most of that day should be spent with you filming yourself scrolling through articles to appear as though you are an evidence-based practitioner. And I don't know where people find the time if they're truly #grinding to read, the full mass article. And we don't expect them to. It's all AI chat GPT text generated anyway. And then the rest of it is us filming ourselves looking like we're writing for our social media.
No, Helms, that's perfect. I think that explains it for everyone. This has been another episode of Iron Call. No. So, Helms, let's kick this off, though, because I think there are numerous points. Like we had that conversation before that we don't need to bring up about some parts of the space and how they view kind of research just in general. And there seems like there's a lot of confusion once again. And there's those 2 streams, right? So the actual evidence hierarchy and like what that actually entails. And then also people that, let's say, are either science interested, where they want to learn about these things. They want to either maximize their progress or they want to keep up to date. And they're trying to understand how to decipher all this information. So please kick it off when we talk about the evidence hierarchy. Some of the stuff maybe recently, I don't know if you want to bring in some examples, not like the 52 set study, but just take it away, man.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Omar. And I think something we do that is really useful in a lot of contexts for learning is we create models or visual representations of things to make people understand how to conceptualize processes or theories or the way things work or maybe best practice. And the evidence hierarchy is one that comes directly out of evidence-based practice or evidence-based medicine, which is designed specifically, or at least originally, for practitioners, specifically medical professionals, to understand, hey, how when I'm staying up to date, should I view evidence? And when we're trying to grade and rank evidence to report consensus, and especially bridge from science to science communication, what do we view as higher quality evidence? Because one of the things that a lot of people struggle with when they're trying to consume evidence-based content is the idea that people are flip-flopping. And the science changes all the time. And I get these headlines and they're telling me chocolate's good for me, chocolate's bad for me. Eggs are a fountain of youth. Eggs are going to kill me. I can't keep up with this stuff. And it seems like a study every week comes out that subverts something else. And part of the reason is that they're not getting any kind of ordered exposure or ranking or hierarchy or priorities of the data that's coming through. And, not related to the evidence hierarchy, it's also being telephoned through media outlets, which are probably misrepresenting the data anyway. So multiple problems there, but if we draw it all the way back to the evidence hierarchy, what is presented to, say, a practitioner? Let's say, and to take away from the joke that I said earlier, let's say you are a allied health professional or a trainer or something like that, and you have dedicated a day to staying up to date with the research. The framing through which you will probably, hopefully, be trying to view it all is the evidence hierarchy. What is the highest, what is the lowest quality evidence, so that when I see conflicts or I'm trying to get a consensus over the broader perspective on the literature, how do I piece it all together to come away with what I think is most likely accurate based on what we know today? And that hierarchy, as all good hierarchies are built, is a pyramid. The ordering, architecturally, you could argue this is not the way it should be. I personally prefer pyramids where the most important information is the foundation, but we'll give this one a pass. It starts with the lowest quality evidence, but it's still evidence, which is important, and then it moves to the highest. And the typical way this is viewed is some iteration on expert opinion / anecdote / observational research being clustered around the bottom. And how that is even ranked is based upon how well controlled is it. Are we actually taking people in a lab and having these observations be validated under certain conditions, et cetera, repeated, but there's no actual intervention where we have a control group or a comparator where we can test if there are differences longitudinally over time. We have some type of observation, and this can be ranked anywhere from, a single person case study observation, or a coach who has data on a team that he publishes on a blog site, or an actual, case series that is published, or a single cohort doing something, and we say, hey, they did this, this is what happened. Is it better than something else? I don't know, because we didn't compare it to anything else. From there, then you get into a little more narrow of a but still delineated sector of controlled trials. Ideally, this is a randomized placebo-controlled trial, but that's not always possible. You can't placebo someone into thinking they're in a low volume or a high volume group, right? You can't necessarily, or you don't always necessarily even have the resources to have a control group. And if you think that resistance training probably does something, then maybe we're not going to have a control group versus a resistance training group. We just have two different resistance training groups. But nonetheless, you're having controlled conditions where ideally, through both the randomization process, having sufficient statistical power, and the intentional control that you're doing in the study, you only have one variable or one system that differs between the two groups, and everything else should be controlled for. So when you see an outcome that differs between the two groups or doesn't, you can attribute that to the intervention. And then on top of that, the tippity top of the pyramid, that is where we have systematic reviews and meta-analyses. So I think you would be very justified as someone in the evidence-based space of going, you know what, I am going to just basically base most of my starting protocols and my conception of how the data are on the most recently published meta-analysis. And I think an important thing is that meta-analyses, they kind of do expire, unlike, say, a randomized controlled trial. A well-done controlled trial, so long as the methods haven't been proven to be systematically flawed sometime 20 years later, they are what they are, if they did things right. But a meta-analysis from, say, 2004 on HMB might look very different than a meta-analysis in 2017, because one is only meta-analyzing 3 studies, and the other one might be 30 or 13 or somewhere in between. And I think that is a very decent heuristic, but there's a far more nuance to it, and there are assumptions in the user's ability to discriminate from high-quality meta-analyses or randomized controlled trials from one another and understand what actually was done. And Trex, you have been a really big proponent of adding more nuance to this discussion and talking specifically, because you're one of the few people in our field, at least, who knows how to do very high-quality meta-analyses, which are becoming more and more common. I would love to hear your take on this and when maybe the evidence hierarchy isn't quite operating in the way it's intended, or when there are threats to its validity and utility in the way it's presented.
Yeah. I mean, I got brainwashed about meta-analyses and systematic reviews because I took, during my PhD, I took an entire semester-long course that was just on systematic reviews and meta-analyses. And it was taught by a guy named Charlie Poole, who's on the Cochrane collaborations. At least at the time, he was on their kind of statistical methodology panel. So the Cochrane collaboration is this group of folks who have been pioneering, I would say, kind of leading the global discussion of meta science for for a long time. So Cochrane reviews, or, following guidelines of the Cochrane collaboration, usually when you slip that into a paper, people say, oh, you're doing all the right stuff that the experts talked about, and kind of figured out over the last few decades or however long it's been around. So anyway, I took this class with Charlie Poole. And I don't want to put words in his mouth, but what my ears heard was a general level of discontent with the way that meta-analyses were being conducted and reported and interpreted. And that was from someone who's not in exercise science. When I told him what folks were getting away with in exercise science, he's experienced enough that he didn't have a panic attack or, faint, because he's been around the block. He's seen the worst of the worst, but you could tell he was just like, yeah, that's pretty rough. And, the field's got a long way to go. And, when I first joined the Mass Research Review, some of the earliest articles I did were on meta-analyses that were published in exercise science journals. And, I, for a couple of them, actually redid the analysis, because the nice thing about a meta-analysis is the data are out there. You can access all the data that the researchers did, unless they had to do a lot of emailing to get like raw data sets sent to them from the original study authors. But, for the most part, you can go grab the data that they grabbed and put it together. Now, I was not redoing these meta-analyses to be pedantic and say, oh, actually, you made a tiny little error here and the effect size should be 0.33, not 0.31. It wasn't some kind of like self-congratulatory exercise in nitpicking. The analyses were wrong. Like you would walk away from the meta-analysis with a conclusion that was objectively inverted. Is this good? The meta-analysis says yes, but the data says no, it's not, or vice versa. So I only would do that when it actually changed the substantive conclusion of the entire summary of the literature. And that's the craziest thing about meta-analysis, is that a meta-analysis is a series of decisions and choices. And where you draw these different lines in the sand and the way that you approach these decisions has a massive impact on this assessment of the literature. So a lesser known fact about meta-analyses is that Carl Pearson is the first person to do the first thing that we would even try to call a meta-analysis, right? And so Carl Pearson, if you've ever read a paper and they say like, oh, we did Pearson correlations, or this was the Pearson correlation coefficient, like a foundational element in statistics, Pearson is kind of on the Mount Rushmore of, statistical pioneers. Just my classic heuristic, my word of caution: never look up the personal beliefs or views of any statistician. You're not going to like what you find. But Pearson did the first meta-analysis a zillion years ago to figure out if the typhoid vaccine works. And he did the meta-analysis and essentially got the wrong answer. So what are you going to do, right? So I don't think a lot of people realize that the top of the hierarchy of evidence has a storied history of just starting out by being wrong, okay? And then, fast forward to today, there are many ways to go wrong with a meta-analysis. So there is a paper by Cadlick and colleagues in 2022, which I reviewed in the hallowed pages of the Mass Research Review. And they looked at the 20 most cited meta-analyses in the field of strength and conditioning. And without getting super nitpicky, just kind of looking at the, basic best practices, they found that 85% of them contained at least one statistical error. Now, that doesn't mean that 85% of them led to the directionally wrong conclusion, right? It doesn't mean that these were tremendously, hugely impactful statistical errors in all cases, but it is a good representation of a general word of caution, which is that when you're looking at meta-analyses, particularly in fields that are not really statistically advanced, there's some fields that statistically are just on a different level. And now that I'm working in an interdisciplinary research group, like when I'm talking with sociologists who have colleagues who are in economics, like economics journals, statistically very advanced. sociology journals tend to be very advanced. And so there's all these different fields where the kind of statistical bar is set in a different place for a variety of reasons that aren't particularly interesting for this podcast. But all of that is to say, when you're looking at a meta-analysis within exercise science, you need to be really cautious about how you interpret that. You can't just take the conclusion at face value. So even though the kind of classic hierarchy of evidence puts meta-analysis at the top, that's probably not appropriate, because I think it does make sense for the hierarchy to have that general pyramid shape, and you're working up from, less robust types of research where the results may not be quite as generalizable to humans in real world conditions, right? We can't have as much confidence in, for example, a mouse study. Saying that surely this will apply to a human being, or an observational study that is purely based on self-reported survey data, right? It's very clear that a randomized controlled trial, those data should be treated with a different level of reverence and interpreted with a different level of confidence. But when it comes to systematic review and meta-analysis, I think because there are so many areas where you can mess it up, we should treat it, I've seen some people reinterpret the hierarchy of evidence where they still have that kind of pyramid shape, and then meta-analysis is almost like this electron cloud, just kind of floating around it, right? It could be trash, it could be incredible. A well-done meta-analysis absolutely should be at the top of that hierarchy of evidence, but I do think that it's a point well taken in some of these kind of electron cloud representations that a meta-analysis is only as good as the quality with which it was done. And so a poorly done meta-analysis is worse than no paper at all. And it could actually be quite damaging in terms of interpretation. So then the question is, well, what does the typical consumer who doesn't have a research background do with a meta-analysis, right? Like I said, probably not a good idea, broadly speaking, to just take, skim the abstract, go to the last sentence. That's usually the conclusion. We can't necessarily take that at face value, but it's actually really tricky to really carefully interpret a meta-analysis and really break it down to see if it was done properly or not. I think our field in exercise science is getting better at this, but I remember only a few years ago, I would get asked to review a lot of meta-analyses, and I wasn't even in an academic position. I'm sitting on my couch eating Cheetos, writing blog articles, and it was because there are not many folks in our field who were comfortable critically appraising and reviewing a meta-analysis, right? So then the question is, so what do we do about that? And I would actually argue that it's good for someone without a lot of research experience and specifically research with interpreting meta-analysis. It's good to be aware of what the current meta-analyses are saying, but it's probably good to kind of triangulate some of them, right? So, for example, if you're seeing that meta-analyses on a topic are kind of, one meta-analysis says this, another one appears to be reaching a totally different conclusion, that's at least enough information to give you pause and say, okay, clearly there's an interesting story to be told here. I'm not really equipped to kind of, discern which of these meta-analyses it should be dictating my application of the information. So at that point, maybe you reach out to an expert in the area, or you lean on some other sources of information. And I would say that, if you see that there's, 6 meta-analyses on the topic and they're all generally pointing the same direction, well, you're probably in pretty good shape there. But in areas where there are not multiple, meta-analyses kind of all gravitating in the same direction, that's an area where we can lean on something that I think we can, in a way, kind of frame this as the top of the non-researcher or kind of consumer-focused hierarchy of evidence, and that would be a consensus paper or a position statement of a reputable group of people. Now, I know a lot of researchers will cringe when they hear that, because you can find, some weird, wacky little professional society with about 6 people who can get together and, self-publish their own consensus statement. That's just absolute nonsense, right? So that's why I had the caveat. a reputable group of folks writing a position statement or a consensus paper, that often can contextualize the discrepancies that might be leading to these inconsistent meta-analytical results and give you a better understanding of how we kind of zoom out and look at this broader area of literature. So that would be my kind of recommendation is, first of all, if you are more on the consumer side than the researcher side, or if you're a researcher who just doesn't have a lot of experience with meta-analysis, of course, it would be a good idea if you're a researcher to build that experience because it's an important part of what we do. I think exercise science is now in a spot where we're kind of all collectively embracing the fact we can no longer like pinch our nose and just do a little, enough statistics to kind of scrape by with your PhD, like to get your dissertation done. We're going to have to figure this stuff out together and kind of lean in and embrace it. And meta-analysis is part of that. But anyway, yeah, so if you are more on the consumer side or a researcher who has not yet built up that skill for interpreting meta-analysis, I think, that's an area where you want to make sure that you heed these words of caution, that there are many meta-analyses out there in our field that do contain considerable errors. There are folks doing meta-analyses in this field who maybe aren't quite up to date with the most current guidelines in terms of how they ought to be done. And so because of that, because there are some of these errors kind of hiding out there, we need to remember not to take just any old meta-analysis at face value. And when necessary, we need to try to, kind of triangulate multiple meta-analyses and kind of see what the consensus of meta-analyses looks like. Or we can lean on a consensus paper, position statement, this type of paper to basically help us sort through some of the inconsistencies or the lack of clarity. And I know it's really funny to put it that way because, there's like an expert review paper, a narrative review written by an expert is usually put at the very bottom of the hierarchy of evidence. And so I understand the contradiction of saying, well, but if you get 6 experts together, now you're cooking, right? So I wish there were a kind of clean heuristic that you could use to say, oh, these are the good experts who we can trust, and those are the ones who are just kind of writing a journal entry and calling it science. It's tricky. It requires a level of discernment. And that's why I say usually folks who are writing on behalf of a highly reputable organization is probably a place where you can place some trust.
That's good stuff, man. And I'm going to just add some kind of coloring in corners and some other takes that I've used as a science communicator to try to help people get a little closer to like a stronger rubric, reducing the likelihood of getting bad data in your kind of algorithm as an individual. So first off, just for those who maybe have not followed some of our more sciencey episodes, what the hell is a meta-analysis? A meta-analysis is a collection of controlled trials or observational trials, depending upon what the research question is. And you can see them in various ways. Sometimes you'll see a meta-regression. Sometimes you'll see a network meta-analysis. But ultimately what they are is taking the quantitative findings from multiple studies that are similar enough to be aggregated and with statistical weighting and appropriate techniques, getting an estimate that includes all of them together to enhance the power and the confidence we have in it, and trying to narrow that confidence interval so that we can have a better estimate of what we think the true effect of something is, or the true comparison, or the true relationship if it's a meta-regression. Now, all meta-analyses include a systematic approach to searching. Sometimes they could be part of a scoping review. Sometimes they could be part of a systematic review. But not all scoping reviews or systematic reviews have a meta-analysis. One of the things you'll see from, say, the Cochrane guidelines or the Prisma guidelines or a few of these other guidelines on how to do this right is something that's very important: how to actually search for and include studies before you even get to the statistical analyses, which are where the errors are that Dr. Frexler talked about. Now, I think there's a lot of value in reading what I would class as high-quality scoping reviews and systematic reviews in the same areas of meta-analysis that don't include the meta-analysis, because you're removing that potential error and you're trading it for the potential bias or human interpretation of the authors. And I think that's actually easier to correct for in some ways. Because one, simply having a systematic search and inclusion criteria that's repeatable, it's transparent. You can typically see a funnel of, hey, we searched for these search terms. We found 4,000 articles. We removed duplicates. Then we screened the titles, the abstracts, and then we included these 13 studies. And when we look at these 13 studies, here are our conclusions subjectively based upon our interpretation of their findings. It's really difficult without a pretty strong bias, or when maybe it's only a single author, to come away with something that's completely in contrast with the findings and that gets through peer review on these topics. So it's possible. I've seen it happen. It absolutely does happen. But here are some things you can do. So if you find a systematic review that is published in a journal, one of the things you probably want to see is that the journal has a decent impact factor. I'm not going to get into the weaknesses and strengths of impact factors, but it basically has to do with how often are they cited and how well are they seen as esteemed in our field. It's not a great metric. And also our impact factors are all remarkably low compared to more developed fields. But generally, if the journal has an impact factor where there is a number in front of the decimal, 1 or greater, it's decent. If you get it over 3, now you're cooking with gas, okay? So, but if you have an impact factor that is 0 point something, maybe just skip over that one. You have to wonder, why did the authors choose to publish it there? Maybe it's because their findings were relatively inconsistent with the general consensus at the moment. Doesn't mean they're wrong, but I would probably stray away from that. Some decent examples would be Sports Medicine Open, Exercise Science Reviews, British Journal of Sports Medicine, except they had that stint where they had some very heavy keto proponents who were the chief editors, had some problems there. So again, this is not rock solid.
Medicine and Science and Sport and Exercise, that's a good one.
Classic, perfect.
Yeah.
That's a great one, absolutely. And another challenge is accessing these. Sometimes you'll want to look for open access journals because you will not necessarily be able to see the other ones because they're behind a paywall, unfortunately. So, decent impact factor, systematic or scoping review, multiple authors ideally, not just a single one. And you're seeing things like Cochrane and Prisma, and like this is a properly done systematic review. And then reading that discussion will probably give you a pretty good idea of what's going on with a low probability of it being completely controversial. And you'll at least be able to see their justification, because like if they're explaining away 10 studies and coming to a conclusion that's opposite, you know, they may not be presenting the findings perfectly, but it'll be a little clearer than just, listen, the data are what the data are, and meta-analysis said no, you know, like that can happen when you read a meta. Now, a well-done position stand typically is basically a systematic review. Sometimes they are done in that manner, not always. And the ones that are probably most relevant to the iron culture listeners, trainers, people interested in lifting, I would say Journal of the International Society of Sports Nutrition. Trexler, you've written a few or been a part of a few position stands. These are going to be focused on things like protein and exercise, specific supplement, et cetera. And they update themselves and make them open access when more data becomes available. And they typically have a ton of authors. Yeah, jizzing, right? If you ain't out there jizzing, then you're just not learning and you're not having fun. Really.
What their acronym is helps.
Yeah, I can only read so many in a day. I find there's a refractory period before I'm able to get into jizzing a couple times in the same day at least. You know, I'm just not as the young man that I used to be, where I could just read a lot of these articles. But jizzing's great. So definitely check that out. Another really good one I find is a journal of the Society of Athletic Trainers. I might be getting that wrong, but the Athletic Training Journal, that might be what it is. They put out some really good stuff. And athletic training, for people who aren't in the States, that's not like training athletes. It's more like an allied health professional who's dealing with acute issues. They're the ones taping and dealing with injury on the field. But they often are directly coordinating with strength conditioning. So they're dealing with a lot of those topics and it is athlete specific. JSCR, Journal of Strength Conditioning and Research, is great, but they're not open access typically, and they don't do a lot of position stands. So while I like that would be the ideal one, I think the closest one is the Journal of Athletic Training. Yeah. So those are my recommendations to throw out there to kind of help color in some of the lines, Trex. I don't know what you think about them.
Yeah, the NSCA, they're the people who publish the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research. they go on streaks where they decide, hey, let's crank out some position stands, and then it kind of gets cold for a while. So they exist, but they're not as JISSN is really adamant about staying on top of relatively updated position statements and position stands. And then the American College of Sports Medicine, ACSM, also has some pretty good position stands. But yeah, I agree. Those are kind of the big ones.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I agree with you. I overlooked the utility of looking at non-meta-analytics systematic reviews as kind of another way to kind of survey the literature without committing to a kind of yes or no interpretation of the data, a very dichotomized decision about how to move forward. And systematic reviews are a nice way to do that, because like you said, you might find someone who does a systematic review and they say, well, there's 13 studies that found one thing, but like, I don't know, I really like the one that found the opposite, and it's like, you can kind of sniff out when they're really trying hard to make a point, so that usually doesn't happen too much, but I like the way that a systematic review at least forces them into saying, because with a narrative review, they can just pretend the other 13 studies didn't happen, right? But with a systematic review, they at least have to put their cards on the table and say, here's why I'm doing gymnastics, to tell you that one paper is better than 14 that contradict it, right? And then a similar kind of thing happens in the process of crafting a position stand. As someone who's been involved with some of them, and a little bit of inside baseball for the listeners, basically you got to get it through everybody. And everybody has some level of expertise regarding the topic at hand. And so all your little fringe ideas that are like your pet theory or your little extrapolation of what is truly known into like what you think sounds just about right, there's going to be someone in that group who says, no, you're taking it a little further than the data would warrant, right? And so sometimes you do get some really interesting and productive back and forth in the process of crafting that position stand, because you got to think about it from the researcher's perspective, right? So, for example, I was on a position stand pertaining to caffeine. And, if they're going to publish a wacky claim about caffeine in there, I'm going to be hearing about it for a while, because people are going to say, well, you're an author on this and you guys made this wacky claim about caffeine and it's something that you talk about all the time. So yeah, position stands, I think, have a really good, they provide a good avenue for the experts basically arguing at length, over email or in the track changes of a document, and basically saying, okay, we're going to interpret this evidence as exhaustively as we can without having any instances of extrapolation or embellishment that one or two authors may wish to entertain. So really good ways to do it. And, I think it might be a good time to segue into maybe talking a little bit about that chain of research that Omar mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Trex.
Yeah.
So, guys, really quickly, love it so far. The easiest layup we could have in the entirety of iron culture for mass. Let me ask this question, but it is a very valid question for what we've been discussing. So, Trex, you mentioned like position stands for like either consumers or those interested that don't have not either conducted research or not in the field. But then what would you say, both of you, and this is a serious question, but like it will be informative to the listener. What is the functional utility then of things like a mass research review or others? Like, hey, let's throw some others under the umbrella, right? So like weightology, like where do they weigh? So the position stand, you want to know, you joked at Helms, you got one day, right? You want to continue education, you got your 7 minutes. I know like how I personally feel, but from you guys, like actually conducting research and so forth, and then with the consumer in mind, how does it straddle like all these lines together and bring something together that does have a high level of utility? So let's start with mass, but let's, we could also mention other ones, but truly, I think this is where it sits in there somewhere. So Helms, Trex, I don't know where you want to take it. And then we could talk about the next topic. All right, guys?
Yeah, that sounds good. I would say the way I view mass as kind of fitting into this whole framework or landscape is the thing about position stands is you need a lot of data before a position stand comes out. And position stands don't come out very frequently, right? So you might get a position stand on caffeine, and that same organization, which may be the organization best suited to write that position stand, they're probably not going to revisit it 2 years from there. They're probably not going to revisit it 4 years from then. Like it may be a once a decade kind of deal where they say, okay, enough has changed, enough has happened, that 10 years later, it's time to go ahead and update our position stand on that topic. Now, that's great, but guess what's going to happen on Thursday? You're going to open up your internet browser to the homepage, and it's going to say, throw out everything you knew about caffeine because this wacky new study came along, right? So I think the benefit of mass is that we every month are staying on top of the literature and providing these critical updates on the research as it's happening, rather than saying, well, in 10 years, a group of experts will tell you what the real deal is, right? So when a new study comes along and causes a lot of headlines, we can address that essentially in real time. If a new study comes along and genuinely, there are sometimes paradigm shifting studies where you say, hey, that position stand from 18 months ago, it's completely different now. Like things are different. Sometimes that happens, not as often as people want to believe sometimes, but a lot of times people think there are a lot more paradigm shifts than there really are. But nonetheless, there are sometimes like critical updates that need to be incorporated into our understanding of a topic. And so with mass, what we can do is provide a much more frequent update of, what I would call, first of all, the topics we cover are pretty much tailored to the folks who listen to Iron Culture. It's who we are. And it's kind of like a more frequent way to do a mini expert consensus where you've got the whole mass team kind of, we peer review our own articles, and every study we're working from the current understanding of a topic, right? So based on the stuff that we know as of the last kind of consensus statement, if one exists, how do these new findings update or change our understanding of the topic? So I think, something like that type of resource, whether it's mass or a different one, is very valuable for someone who needs an answer now and wants to know what this newest study actually means for them. And then usually when I look at my Instagram, those are the questions I get, in my DMs. It's not someone saying, I've never thought about caffeine. What is it, right? It's always like, hey, man, I heard this new thing based on this new study. I don't know what to make of it. Do you guys have an opinion on this? And so, yeah, I think mass kind of addresses what is most commonly the type of question that people are wrestling with and trying to actually act upon and implement.
Helps.
Yeah, I think a really important thing is to have an idea of when do paradigms shift, because there are repeatable patterns of when and why they shift. And it is not the same type of study being done finding something different. So a great example is the notorious quote unquote 52 set study that got around a lot. And that got a lot of attention because it had some potential headline worthy stuff. The highest volume group worked up to 52 sets, right? It's the highest volumes that's ever been seen in the literature. It seems absurd. People are claiming it's impossible. There's people giving, I'll give you money if you're able to do this. That must be a lie, etc. But ultimately, when you look at the broader perspective of the research, it's a waste of time to spend too much energy on another group versus group comparison of different volumes. And there's no reason this one study should influence you more. In fact, there's reason it should influence you less than, say, the two most recent meta-analyses on volume by Schoenfeld in 2017 and Basval in 2021, which fortunately were done sufficiently well enough that we know that their findings are accurate, even if there might be an error somewhere in there. I'm not saying I would know, Trexler would. But I know from talking to Trexler and James Steele and other folks involved, like James Krieger, that they have the right point estimate and the right directionality. Their findings are generally correct. So the thing about these studies that are headline changing, and they're really common in nutrition, like, oh, this food is actually bad for you. No single study should change your opinion. The studies that generally do create paradigm shifts are more often methods papers, right? So, for example, the DeMoss study that came out in 2016 that said, hey, there's this extreme amount of muscle damage that may not be connected to actual hypertrophy that is driving muscle protein synthesis results. There was a lot of discussion around, muscle damage is not a mechanism of hypertrophy. And I was kind of like saying, hey, that maybe, but that we can't really know for sure. But we do need to be aware that muscle damage contributes to MPS. And anytime you're doing an MPS study, which links back to the last episode where we talked about why MPS doesn't necessarily always reflect what's really going on under the hood for longitudinal outcomes or even acute outcomes, that is meaningfully influencing the MPS response. And we think the validity of this construct of us measuring the kinetics of traced amino acids moving to muscle using this whole method is representing at least acute drivers of hypertrophy. It's not. It's heavily confounded by the damage response that's occurring. So that means any study that is done on short-term MPS, where we're using an unaccustomed exercise or novice lifters, we can't know. At least, I don't want to be too harsh. I was going to say we can't know anything from them, which may be close to true. At the very least, if the research question is about how does this potentially influence hypertrophy, we can't actually know that because it's confounded by damage, right? If the research question was, hey, what's the MPS response, collectively of some aggregate amount of damage and stimulus, yeah, that's what the MPS response is. Is that useful? Probably not. So that's an example of something that is paradigm shifting. The meta-regression that was recently published on failure, if and when that goes through peer review and comes out, again, it's a meta-regression, it's a meta-analysis. That actually, because of the way it was done, is giving us different information, not hugely, but substantially different from even the last meta-analysis that was done in a more binary fashion, and seems to have shown us something because of a useful, novel way of analyzing the data that we were not able to previously see when analyzing on a more systematic review, kind of vote counting style of study versus study. How many do we have in terms of failure? How many not? That did create a paradigm shift. But it's not going to be a single RCT using existing methods. It's going to be, hey, there's something we didn't realize about this method. Hey, there's a systematic error in the population we're testing or something like that. Some really great papers coming out of Tinsley's lab, like there's obligatory fat-free mass gain when you gain body fat and fat-free mass loss when you lose body fat. That's really interesting. Or some of these meta-analyses that are done in a different way. So I think that's just important to know. It's rarely going to be just a new RCT done the same way. That will shift the next meta-analysis or position stance point estimate to some degree or increase the variability, but that won't be, by definition, a paradigm shift. So that's why we need to focus less on these single studies.
Yeah, and I was going to say a couple other examples that are, just to kind of reinforce the point, for the longest time, a lot of folks were talking about caffeine as if it was like a very deleterious thing and that coffee drinking was pretty objectively terrible for you. And that had been the kind of working understanding for quite some time before people realized, hey, people who drink a lot of coffee, they smoke a lot of cigarettes, and we haven't been controlling for that at all. And so that completely flipped the results of the pre-existing literature on coffee consumption once you control for that confounding effect of cigarette smoking. Another thing is, some of the early studies looking at muscle thickness in response to different exercise and training programs. Once we started to kind of realize the impact and the time course of edema, basically fluid retention for, a certain period of time after, damaging exercise occurs, some folks are saying, wow, look at this weird amount of hypertrophy. And it was actually acute swelling that was impacting, some ultrasound measurements. So there's a lot of nuance, obviously, that goes into interpreting these different types of scientific studies. And, I know sometimes it sounds like we're getting into the weeds of it and digging into these details just for fun. But, when I was back at UNC many years ago, I made my life a lot harder. I had a very, being candid, I had a very easy teaching assignment. And I said, no, forget that. I'm going to get together with some colleagues and we're going to build a new course from scratch. And it was all about science literacy. And the reason that we built that at our own expense, it was very painful and a lot more effort than what I was supposed to be doing that semester. The reason we did it was because this stuff matters. You know, we kind of realized collectively, it was me and a computational physicist and a epidemiologist. And at that time, I was strictly doing, mostly controlled trials, lab-based science, more applied trials. And so we were in these completely different areas of research, doing completely different types of research, basic, observational, controlled interventions. And all of us were looking around saying, the students we're teaching in our classes are getting completely thrown off by these conflicting headlines going back and forth that are looking at different types of research and basically not contextualizing them whatsoever. And there's this kind of constant changing of headlines, and we need to help students, we need to build them up with a toolkit and give them some experience so that they can work their way through this. So I think something like mass ultimately plays a role in that, but it's really important, and it kind of gets back to this idea of a chain of research, of these different types of studies that occur, and the need to contextualize them. And, like I was saying, we don't just do this stuff for fun. It really matters. Like I remember, I'm sure a lot of folks have had experiences like this, but talking to someone you care about and saying, hey, I noticed that you're using a margarine product that has like a tremendous amount of trans fat in it, and I wish you wouldn't, because like trans fat's terrible for you. It's not uncommon in that type of scenario for someone to say, here we go again. Because 15 years ago, they were telling me that the margarine was better than the butter, and now they're saying the butter's better than the margarine. And the normal, rational response to all these conflicting headlines is to say, screw it. I don't care, right? And that's a huge burden, both at the individual level and the population level, of people checking out of science and not being able to engage in behaviors that are directly beneficial to them, because of course they're checking out. It's a matter of folks who have the capability and have the inclination. It's very beneficial for us to sort out what this evidence actually means, cut through the headlines, and communicate that and share it with the people who can actually use it. So, the reason that we made that course was because this stuff matters, and it's difficult to sort through all these different types of research when the headlines that really circulate make no effort to do so.
Trex. And it's the current conversation that's going on now that we've talked about, the whole let's throw out the science and just go back to what we can observe because of that sentiment. And that sentiment is not only earned because of just the complexity and the science literacy needed, but also because there is active disinformation that is produced by people who are using science as marketing. I'm selling a product. I'm using science-based as a marketing strategy, and I will cherry pick the data purposefully or focus on the findings which support this. And that is happening at expectedly, but not unsurprisingly, high rates. And that's just happening alongside all the things that we're dealing with within the scientific community, where we're just trying to do a better job. And then the science communication industry, which exists because the science community is relatively insular. And that's not, sometimes it's kind of just by, I'm not going to say by design, but it's by tradition. And sometimes it is by the nature of the level of science literacy needed to communicate the type of stuff we're talking about. As much as we're trying to get into the weeds here, we're really just touching upon kind of the tip of the iceberg in some of these issues. Like for example, I had to hold my tongue, and now I'm not even doing it, in that I don't actually think we have fully explored the time course of edema and what is an appropriate way of assessing a muscle thickness when different variables change, like failure or higher volumes. And I don't think we have the seminal paper that tells us here's how long you need to wait and what factors influence it yet. And there's even some people critiquing right now saying, hey, let's throw out all the volume data because they're only waiting 72, to 48 to 72 hours. But they don't actually, to not give them credit, there's no data to suggest that they're right, that that's too much of a confounder over that period either. So there's open questions that exist like that. And then the question is, well, how do I actually measure that? Because if I wait longer, then I might be seeing actual atrophy.
Right.
And there's no easy answers here, folks. But the point is if there's that level of complexity within the people doing it honestly, the fact that there's dishonest actors trying to appear as though they are doing the whole evidence-based thing that are actually just trying to sell you something or have a very clear bias, man, it's tough to be a consumer right now. And we're trying to solve fundamentally different problems than we were trying to solve 15 years ago as science communicators, where it was lack of access to the information and there not being the information out there at all. Now the information's out there, but it's in a sea of information. So it is quite challenging. And information overload is a persistent problem. But that's why we're talking about this. The evidence hierarchy with the modified consumer version enables you to not get caught up in the fast-flowing stream of new results that seem catchy that get, platformed on media outlets as well as social media, because that's what drives the algorithm, that seem crazy, and the whole purposeful information stream that gets you to click of everything you thought you knew was wrong. Can happen, as we talked about. Most of the time it's not happening. So yeah, do we want to get into the information chain as another useful tool of trying to go through this, Trexler?
Yeah, just before we move on, I wanted to make sure I said this. I know some people are going to pull out that little clip of Helms saying, I'm cherry picking science to sell products to you, and they're going to edit the audio to make it sound muffled like it was some kind of hot mic that caught him saying that, and they're going to use it against Helms. And I just want to discourage people from doing that because that would be inappropriate.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you preempted that, because everyone was thinking that before you even said it. So for
that you'd be in a compromised position, and that's why I do want to say, before we move on to talk about the research chain and when it could or maybe should be broken, just to go back to mass for a second, and this isn't the promotion part, because I think both of what you said is fantastic, but as an outside observer, what both of you just hinted at, information overload, consumer fatigue, right, of hearing many different sources of information seemingly equally valid, saying, opposing kind of views. I think what's neat, it's like, imagine you have educators, your favorite teachers or whatnot, and then you have open access. I think an underrated component that you almost can't quantify, but just as a human makes it seem like a more trustworthy source, is you have these 4 people now, part of Mass, that are putting out information, that have internal peer reviews, right, that they do themselves. But because they communicate on social media and in open spaces, all the ideas can be challenged. It's usually when things are veiled behind some sort of curtain, or it's like, a one-way kind of form of communication, it becomes more difficult. But because you guys are putting yourself out there, you're communicating with other educators, other researchers in the field, you can't just say wild shit, because it will get challenged. And even this is like, let me boost Lane Norton from what I'm about to say for a second, because he's out there, he's fighting, the fight, he's putting out really good information. But as an example, you're joking before, Trex, about Helms, like the master's thesis and so on and so forth. But like Lane Norton, like his position has changed as it relates to BCAAs. And he's someone that conducted research on that. And as the years went by, his position changed. He's now communicating in a place where he could be challenged, or other things can be challenged. So it's not like they're either set in stone, and it's not like you're saying, hey, this is our position here. Oh, what? You want to communicate it with us? You can't. There's that ability for people with either things like mass office hours or other people in the space. And that's why you brought up Helms like James Krieger, like Wadeology, where it's not just like the 4 people in your hidden fortress, right? Like kind of cranking out these articles, and that's it. No one can either challenge if ideas need to be challenged. And that openness, I think, is a central metric of actually having a place that is trustworthy, because if it's veiled behind either paywalls, or like you're not willing to, not that you need to debate these ideas, and I do think debates overall can be vastly overrated, but just an exchange and flow of ideas is very necessary. It's just a very cool way where you can have people that you respect in space put out the information, you could communicate directly with them. And it is also of a contemporary nature, to your point, Trexler, where, some of these position stands, because they need to be cautious, because you need a large amount of people to agree on them, they could kind of lag behind some of the things that are coming out immediately. And so people on social media, they're seeing, as you said, the latest like caffeine review now, and they want to know about it within the next like month or few months, not 5 years from now. So there's kind of a time course benefit to it. There's the openness aspect to it. And then there's the reputation that you guys have been able to accrue from years and years and years. I'm done with that.
Thank you, Omar.
Yeah.
And I think this brings up a really good point that is not on topic, but it is. And then we'll go to this. I promise I won't tangent this too bad. And we've often said that we have critiques of capitalism ever since that first episode with James Krieger, where he talked about how obesity is kind of the natural occurrence of food availability. It's a throwback to one of our original iron culturisms.
Shout out
But I'm
Krieger.
going to boost up shout out James Krieger. I'm going to boost up capitalism for a second. There are times, there's many times where the market, if you will, can align in such a way that is beneficial to the consumer. You know, competition, choice, access, if it's open, that transparency, there's caveats to it. But in all cases, a really important thing for the consumer is that they understand the reward mechanisms involved so they can assess what they're looking at. So for example, on social media, the reward mechanisms are all driven towards boosting up usage of the app, and for the individual users on the app, whether it is YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, whatever, it is them trying to get more clicks and views. Even someone who, like me, is trying to use the platform to get you good information, the barrier to entry is I have to get you to see it. So there are potentially concessions, and I try not to let the ends not justify the means, or vice versa. You know, like I try not to let the means subvert the ends, I guess is what I should say. I have to make concessions to make the post or the video or what have you get you to look at it. Because if I just went with pure accurate information, it's literally getting downgraded in terms of your likelihood to see it and engage with it, factors of 10, not exaggerating.
Yeah.
So Omar has talked about this, the care and attentiveness that YouTubers give, and those who survive and have big channels, to the thumbnail and the title, which surprised most people. So the reward mechanisms there are, I'm competing for your attention. Competing for your attention is not necessarily the same thing as what we do at mass, which is we're trying to gain a subscriber who is willing to give us money on a regular basis to help them in some way. And it's not monthly applications in strength, sport, and keto, or monthly applications in high-intensity training. So what are we selling? Because we are obviously biased, and this benefits us to get subscribers. What are we attempting to do? We're trying to give useful information to people, and that they're only going to stay subscribed if they feel it is useful, right? So when you have someone who is not selling a specific approach to nutrition or training, most of these research reviews, I think that they sit in that space, and their survival depends upon people going, yep, this is continually useful for me to keep giving you my bank details or my credit card details to keep charging. That's a good thing, right? This is one of those times where the market is telling you something. Okay, there's different reward mechanisms involved there. And the reward mechanisms for publishing are generally good. I mean, there are some issues with academia, but like a position stand, like the Journal of the International Society of Sports Nutrition, for example, when they put out a position stand, to be seen as a reputable international society where people come to their conference, they get their certification, they pay their membership fees, it behooves them to put out accurate information that is useful to academics and practitioners in the sports nutrition field. The issues, though, and like the potential, differences between these are the time course, the level of nuance, and to who they're trying to communicate to is a little more insular. How technical is the language? Are they going to include anecdotes, things like that, versus mass and a position stand coming out more frequently, et cetera? But we also have our weaknesses. We're not getting peer-reviewed by the journal editors. There's not 10 of us on each article. You're accepting the potential biases and the collective social arrangement that the four of us have. We're doing the best we can, and obviously if we're getting it wrong enough to where we're not helping our subscribers, they're not going to stay subscribed. But you can't really even make that analysis or decide which biases are worth it in which case and what would I do as a consumer if you're not aware of the reward mechanisms. So I think that's critically important, and I will leave that there if we want to move on to the research chain. But just be very aware of what's going on in any ecosystem where this kind of stuff develops organically. It's always based upon what carrot is in place, right? And if you don't understand the carrots, you can misunderstand things. You can be like, yeah, why wouldn't I listen to Dave Asprey? Well, think about it. Like, what is going on here? Why wouldn't I listen to the most recent TikToker on the rise,
Well said. Research chain, Trex, and when it should be broken. What's going on with that? So we had the evidence hierarchy, then for consumers. You brought up, so in the last episode, which we recorded 2 days ago, the idea of like ecological validity, with the longitudinal studies, you're talking about protein, and then you're also talking from acute mechanistic research. But based upon everything that we've been discussing with the, let's say, the amount of research that's been conducted in a particular field, when should sometimes that research chain be broken, or when should it be challenged? The ideas that you've been bringing up before, like as someone that's trying to understand a lot of this information, how do you sift through everything?
Yeah, it's interesting, that I think first we should start by kind of just describing what we mean by a chain of research, right? And that is the idea that there are multiple types of research that feed into each other, right? And so I would say probably the most common way that this is discussed or kind of thought about is you've got, for example, observational research, right? So we are human beings going about our day-to-day life, and we happen to notice some patterns in the world around us, right? So observational research, you might say, you know what? Every time I'm in the hospital and I'm in the oncology unit, there seem to be a lot of people who are smoking on their way in. What might be going on there, right? And so there's observational research, and a lot of times we'll pick up on these patterns, and they'll, be so striking, whether they're in a research context or we're just like, this can't be a coincidence, right? Then maybe we start digging, the collective we, and we start to work out mechanisms. Is it possible that in these rodent models that exposure to, combustion byproducts might actually fuel the growth of cancer cells or tumors, when they're inhaled, right? So we've got this observational research, and then we might do some basic research, which is another term for more mechanistically oriented research, to try to figure out, can we explain what we appear to be observing in the world around us in these kind of hyper-controlled, kind of artificially controlled environment where I have a rodent with a particular genetic makeup that I get to choose, and I control their entire life, every element of it, and I can observe them for their entire lifespan under these, completely contrived conditions that I've created. And then, when appropriate, we'll then see that get kind of extended to what is often framed as like the last link in that research chain, which is more translational research or more applied research. This would be the kind of thing where we would have more ecological validity, which is another way of saying, hey, this really, it doesn't just generalize to day-to-day life. It's actually like pretty reflective of how we wish to apply this to the real world. So building on a poorly chosen example that I rolled with of, cigarette smoking and cancer, that'd be like if we were morally bankrupt enough to decide, let's go ahead and do a randomized controlled trial. And once these folks turn 18, we're going to randomize them to two groups. You folks are going to smoke 2 packs a day. You folks are never going to touch a cigarette in your life, and we'll check in 20 years and see how it's going, right? So obviously that's not something we'd want to do for ethical reasons, but you get the idea. Getting more close to our area of resistance training and muscle growth, right? You might notice, hey, people who do a particular thing, they sure seem to be jacked, right? And so then you go in and you do some rodent studies where you're tweaking these things in the lab and say, wow, the mice got really jacked. And then you kind of wrap it all up with a translational study where you actually turn that into, 2 different artificial conditions that you're experimentally testing head-to-head in human beings who lift weights for 24 weeks or however you want to set it up. So like I said, it's usually framed as this perfectly linear chain where we observe a thing, we figure out why we might be observing that thing, and then we figure out if we can actually act upon that new understanding that we've cultivated. But in reality, these things are always these different types of research are always interacting with one another. It's no longer a linear chain from observation to mechanism to applied finding. For example, when we do that applied study, we might say, you know what? We keep getting a different thing than we thought, right? And so then that spurs new mechanistic research to figure out why we keep seeing this in the applied trials, right? So you can see how once the world is set in motion and we've got these three different types of research happening simultaneously, now everything's just ricocheting. There's observations, there's ideas, there's unexpected findings, and now it's all just kind of moving together at once. And in my new role, now that I've kind of re-entered the academic research world, I think it's really cool that, I'm not doing any, well, I guess actually I am doing some kind of fairly mechanistic stuff pertaining to energy expenditure, but I'm mostly dealing with, very applied translational studies, but I'm also getting into a lot more observational stuff right now, it's really fun to be able to do both, because instead of feeling like you're always 2 years away from your next finding, where you have to plan out a study, get it funded, do the whole thing, analyze it, it's nice to be able to supplement that and kind of test your own hypotheses through observational means before you dive in and plan a very resource-intensive study. So that's the chain of research. And Helms, I think maybe you would be equipped to kind of take it from there and talk about what that means to the typical consumer of information, and where we sometimes have to kind of deviate from our normal understanding, which is that until I've seen it done in a translational study where people are actually making better gains, I'm not touching it.
No, I think that's a great transition. And this is a really, really important understanding by the consumer, because even if you dive into the research, you're not going to see, at least in our fields that are relevant to this, applied nutrition science, applied strength conditioning research, fitness science. It's not judiciously followed because of the structure and nature and the reward mechanisms that are involved in these fields. So I'm obviously not the first person to ever talked about this, but I kind of quote unquote coined or tried to popularize the term, the research chain, and talked about it a lot over the last few years, because the consistent issue that we see in our area is people leaping from mechanism to application. And that's a useful way of saying everything's changed. It's a useful way of saying, hey, buy my supplement. It's a useful way of painting a picture that conflicts with the consensus. Like, for example, if you want to sell low carb books. And it's unfortunately because of the way that the philosophy of science is not well taught in sports science, exercise science, and I'll say sports nutrition science, because I think nutrition science is a little advanced compared to others. I don't think a lot of the researchers involved really think about this. And speaking of reward mechanisms, for example, if you publish in the Journal of the Strength Conditioning Research, there's a section that says practical applications. So even if you go in there and you publish a relatively mechanistic study, and it's not a ton of mechanistic studies that go into JSCR, obviously strength conditioning by definition is an applied field, but I'll give you one recent one that we're kind of struggling with on a PhD student, specifically doing a modeling paper on induced acceleration analysis during the squat. And the idea here is trying to get an idea of the accelerations that are produced by different joint interactions and joint muscle interactions that are impacting the movements that these muscles are not even crossing. So really briefly, and this will be useful for those who are on YouTube but not on a podcast, if you were to take your arm out to your side and act like you were throwing a rock, if I am contracting my shoulder through my anterior deltoid contracting, and if I just let the rest of my arm go slack, there's going to be movement in my elbow joint, because of the acceleration induced in my shoulder, right? So this is something that's not often accounted for in most of our traditional biomechanical modeling, is the impact of a movement at a joint by the muscles that cross it on a joint that is not crossed by that muscle. We kind of think almost like just from the old cadaver studies. So anyway, we did some biomechanical modeling, and we're talking about in a model. So this is computer analysis based upon actually observed humans. But it is absolutely mechanistic research. It's, a 2-hour study, and it's involved, modeling. So it's not, we did this and we trained this and we found this. And we're going, hey, actually we think the plantar flexor might be having a pretty significant effect on knee and hip extension, right? In this model. And the practical applications, what are we going to say? Do calf raises to improve your squat? Well, we're kind of funneled down saying something like that. We don't really want to. Ideally, there wouldn't even be that. But we also want to get this understanding out to practitioners and not just publish in the Journal of Sports Biomechanics where only biomechanists see it. And we want to have the language that is useful. And that creates issues. So we're being forced in the field of sports nutrition and applied exercise science to always make it applied. So when you're someone who is a EMG researcher, when you're someone who is a muscle protein synthesis researcher, when you're someone who is researching hormone response to training or nutrition, you probably haven't been taught about the philosophy of science to understand how these different pieces fit together. What you have been taught is how to use your method. One thing I consistently see in sports science graduate students is the term methodology and method to them are synonyms. They are not. Methodologies actually refer to epistemology, our actual understanding of how do we know things. Epistemology is the knowledge of how we gain knowledge. So, for example, you could take a qualitative approach to knowledge or a quantitative approach to knowledge. And then within the qualitative field, there's a ton, from critical realism to everything else that I don't even understand. But the idea is that if you don't even understand that methodology is about assessing how do I discern truth, and methods are actually like EMG or MPS, right? Then why would we expect someone to go, oh, I need to couch my interpretations in relation to this research chain that no one told me has existed? I've been trained very well on how to do this analysis, and I know the reliability statistics, hopefully, on it. And I know its limitations, I think, to the degree I've been taught. We shouldn't really have the expectation that that person is going to do the due diligence to go, right, this is just the acute growth hormone response. Now, we know growth hormone is related to hypertrophy, but we can't extrapolate and say this is related to hypertrophy. And in fact, the exact opposite occurs in the research by some of the most prominent researchers in our field. And I would argue that the most common error that you see in our area, and with very large disastrous consequences in the scope of what could be considered a disaster in this relatively not disastrous conversation, have occurred due to extrapolating from mechanistic data to applied data. The first example that I can think of is the hormone hypothesis, where there was a ton of acute growth hormone and testosterone responses to training protocols that actually made their way, in the absence of any applied research, into textbooks on how to do hypertrophy training. You need to do exclusively compound exercises, sometimes in giant sets or supersets, or at least with no longer than 90 seconds of rest between them. Oh, and at least with moderately high reps, because growth hormone will be high. So you see a hypertrophy protocol of I need you to do squat, leg press, RDL, 60 seconds rest, and 8 to 15 reps on each one. And you're like, so you want me to throw up? That's what I've learned from this, right? And those were all based upon what will result in the highest hormonal response that was actually just a proxy for the metabolic cost of energy when you really think about it. And lo and behold, no one actually decided, hey, if I want to create the rest intervals, exercise selection, and rep ranges for hypertrophy, maybe I should do studies where I actually measure, hypertrophy. So that was a decade-long series of research that extended and did not really start getting seriously critiqued until the late 90s, early 2000s. And we see similar patterns with EMG. We see similar patterns, which Eric did a great job on the last episode with MPS, and it continually repeats. So while I can keep ringing this bell, and others, of course, are as well within the scientific community, and peer review, when it goes right, should catch this. And ideally, committee chairs and supervisors and graduate advisors and teachers are changing this paradigm. It's not a consistent thing that I'm seeing changing within science. So it's going to keep happening. So that means that you as the consumer need to be heavily aware of this. Because even if we do fix this within science, you're still going to have Gary Taubes trying to sell you a book, right? You're still going to have someone telling you, hey, plants are trying to kill you. You should probably just buy my book on the carnivore diet or buy my supplement. So even when we do clean up our own house, which we're actively doing, there's still going to be people coming in for outdoors saying, yes, my name is Mr. Sheep. I am definitely not a wolf in sheep's clothing. Please ignore the snout. It's just a strange variation. Our family has always had big noses. So how do you guard against that? And the concept of the research chain for the consumer is that you need to put your weight of confidence in something that directly measures the outcome of interest in very ecologically valid situations, right? So ideally, we're looking at training studies. Ideally, we're looking at long-term interventions. Ideally, we're looking at relevant populations to us. And ideally, we're looking at things that are truly translational. And that is where I spent most of my time. And when you see high-quality translational research, it is very much an exchange of ideas with the actual practitioners. So, for example, we will do surveys of powerlifters, surveys of bodybuilders, surveys of coaches, qualitative interviews with them, understand what they're doing, what they think is happening, and why, and then we will go back and test them. And likewise, sometimes we will have hypotheses because we're aware of the research and the practice, see where there's disparities or agreement, do studies and find out something, feed it forward to the practitioners. They will then try to implement that in practice and say it does or doesn't work, or it impacts these things, or logistically it doesn't work, comes back to us, and then we refine it. That's ideally the way it goes, and that you have this chain going from mechanistic or bench research to applied to translational that is also communicating back and forth with the practitioners, and they're part of this research chain in the more modern conceptualization of it. Now, sometimes even that gets subverted, and I want to kick it back to you, Trexler, on this. I think the most obvious examples here are in nutrition science, and this does come in most of the time in the form of a goalpost shift. So you'll find someone who has a specific pet theory. Let's say that low-carb diets or high-carb diets or vegan diets or carnivore diets are actually the cause of or the solution to the obesity epidemic or heart health or what have you. And when it suits them, if there is epidemiological observational data that does support their position, they're happy to say, see, you can see it here if you just can get the signal from the noise. When it doesn't suit them, they'll say, listen, let's go back to that hierarchy of evidence. No. Give me an RCT, okay? I want to see the RCT showing me that the vegan diets over 10 years are actually more healthy than this. And then they'll also leverage like evidence of absence being absence of evidence, or vice versa, excuse me. So talk to me, Trexler, about when it's not realistic or feasible or even the best tool to follow strictly, okay, I want to merge these two concepts to come together. I want something as high up that evidence hierarchy as possible, and I want it to be translational applied, or I'm going to maintain my current biases.
Yeah, there are a number of instances where we don't really get what we want, right? So we would love to get that idea, that long RCT in a population that is exactly like us, so that we can figure out, is this going to be good for me or not? Or is there a high likelihood that this will be good for me or not? One example where we're just not going to get that would be if we're in a very unique population, right? So the classic example in our world, Helms, is that there's a lot of bodybuilders making their decisions based on studies that were not done in bodybuilders, because there's not a lot of training studies done in bodybuilders, because there's not a lot of bodybuilders compared to the relative percentage of the world that is a competitive bodybuilder currently is not high, right? So there's going to be sometimes you have to make concessions with regards to the population being studied. Sometimes you'll have to make concessions with regards to ethical constraints. Like it's just not appropriate to do an RCT on a particular topic. Therefore, we're going to have to do our best and just try to, figure it out. Sometimes there will be logistical constraints, right? So, for example, this is one that hits nutrition a lot. A lot of folks will say, I think that this particular diet is better or worse for heart disease, right? And so you'll say, well, then show me an RCT of this diet actually causing, fatal myocardial infarction. Well, if you really believe it's going to cause fatal heart attacks, you probably aren't going to be getting clearance to do an RCT on it in the first place. But even if you could, who is going to be signing up for a tightly controlled diet study that's going to last literally the rest of their life? And who's going to fund a tightly controlled diet study that lasts more than a couple months? I mean, it's just prohibitively expensive. Helms.
I want to highlight your point with one of the most famous examples of a systematic review of randomized controlled trials that was published in 2003 on parachute use. And I'm just going to read just the abstract verbatim because it's an excellent teaching tool that really gave me a big light bulb moment when I was viewing the topics we're talking about. All right. So published in the British Medicine Journal Parachute Used to Prevent Death and Major Trauma Related to Gravitational Challenge, a systematic review of randomized controlled trials. And their objectives were to do a systematic review of looking at whether parachutes are effective in preventing major trauma related to gravitational challenge. They did their systematic search. The results: we were unable to identify any randomized controlled trials of parachute interventions. Conclusions: as with many interventions intended to prevent ill health, the effectiveness of parachutes has not been subjected to rigorous evaluation by using randomized controlled trials. Advocates of evidence-based medicine have criticized the adoption of interventions evaluated by using only observational data. We think that everyone might benefit if the most radical protagonists of evidence-based medicine organized and participated in a double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled crossover trial of the parachute.
Yeah, so exactly. I certainly would not be signing up for a study where there's a 50-50 shot I'm randomized to jumping out of a plane in the control condition without a parachute. And so in some nutritional applications, it's not quite as extreme, but you kind of get the idea where there are certain dietary patterns that folks implement and advocate for that are so contradictory to established medical guidelines. It'd be very difficult to argue to an ethics board, yeah, I'm going to randomize people to this wacky diet pattern and hope they're okay for a long period of time, right? Now, here's one issue, okay? So we've talked about how sometimes you're not going to be able to get exactly what you want, that, perfect, ecologically valid, translatable, randomized controlled trial with a long enough duration to capture your actual outcome of interest. So a lot of times a workaround for that, and again, this is really common in nutrition, is, well, we can't do a randomized controlled trial that is ethical and fundable and long enough to actually assess heart attack, right? Myocardial infarction. But we can do an RCT, within, certain constraints that looks at a biomarker that we believe is predictive of long-term cardiovascular disease development and progression. And the playbook that keeps this whole wheel spinning in terms of information and disinformation and misinformation and arguments and debates and all that stuff is that then you dispute the validity of the biomarker. And you say, well, how do you know that biomarker is actually predictive of heart attack? And you say, well, we've got all these observational epidemiological studies showing these correlations. They say, well, who cares about an epidemiological study? I mean, show me the actual randomized control, and so now we get caught in this multi-directional loop where you kind of choose your path of when you value different elements of this research chain.
But what about high LDL, but in the presence of low triglycerides? And doesn't particle size matter, Eric? I mean, I think we've got this all wrong.
Exactly. So the challenge with all these different types of research is that they have different strengths, they have different limitations, they are observations that occur in tremendously different contexts. And so if you feel compelled enough to make an argument, you can usually find some entry point at some layer, grab an argument that lends some degree of support to your case, and then kind of dive in elsewhere in this chain and grab something else, and you can cobble something together. And, one of the ones that kind of drives me nuts is the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity, right? It's the, actually, to get lean and have good cardiometabolic health, we should all be on extremely low carb diets. The idea is that when you have a high carbohydrate meal, the post-meal response involves a large release of insulin. That insulin drives all the nutrients in your bloodstream into fat cells and starves your lean tissues. And that causes, by impacting appetite control and appetite feedback, it causes you to overconsume to actually seek out nutrients for your lean tissues. That's kind of how the carbohydrate insulin model was first operationalized and put together. If you look at the most recent reviews, they've shifted the goalposts a bit, and now they're like, okay, well, so technically, yes, if you have the willpower, then you can override all that crap, and the energy balance model totally explains weight regulation and body composition. But come on, no one can possibly overcome the appetite stimulating effects in the real world of large insulin releases. Now, let's not pay any attention to the fact that the only like legitimate thing that you could call a paradigm shift in obesity treatment in the last 20 years, I would say, is through these incretin mimetic drugs, like, you know, what are they, like Wegovy, semaglutide, choose all your names, right? There's a bunch of them. Ozempic is the one I was searching for. They increase insulin release. Increasing insulin release through these drugs is the only meaningful progress we've made in obesity treatment. That's hyperbolic, but I would say the most considerable leap that we've made in the last 20 years. So I've never heard, I mean, I'm sure there's some contrived argument out there where it's like, okay, so let's factor that into the carb insulin model. And then eventually, here's my prediction. In 20 years, the carbohydrate insulin model is going to be, you know, some folks really do a better job cutting their calories when they eat fewer carbs. And that's going to be it. And that is true. But there's also like 30 other ways to do it. But basically, this kind of goalpost shifting is,
to give a ton of credit to Ben House, don't get too frustrated when you're arguing with someone and they shift the goalposts, because especially if it's not lateral, if it's maybe closer to your position and towards compromise, because that's actually a win. Our cognitive dissonance and our desire to hold on to our beliefs and feel safe in our carefully constructed house of cards that prevents us from being completely nihilistic and maintaining our worldview will only, especially when being observed by others and being debated and challenged and chest thumping your ego, is only going to allow you to shift so far, and depending on how evolved of a human you are. So if you get someone to shift that goalpost a little bit, which is far more likely to happen in scientific research, that's a good thing. Don't just think of it as, oh man, that's a cheat in debate. Like, okay, great, because you're moving closer towards something that actually fits the data. And if in 20 years the carbohydrate insulin model is effectively just, you know, I feel a little better when I eat avocado, bro, then awesome, because now we have more consensus and we're giving people less false information.
Yeah, I'm with you in spirit. But you know, from peer reviewing my mass article that's coming out in 6 days, that there's still a whole lot of quibbling over the data and working very, very hard and doing a lot of gymnastics to say that the energy balance model is debunked, even though it's squarely not debunked and fully valid. So,
listen, I fully expect them to hit every branch on the way down, fall off the tree, but I do think they're falling off the tree.
Yeah. No, I'm with you. And I do agree in spirit that goalpost shifting in the face of, you know, irrefutable evidence is still moving everyone toward a more coherent understanding and interpretation of the matter. So I'm with you there. But I think that particular argument, it happens to be the argument that dominates nutrition research, and nutrition research is a slippery area of research because we're not able to do these perfect translatable randomized controlled trials that we all wish we had. I think nutrition lends itself to a perfect example of why this research chain matters. And I think in a very frustrating way, how having all these different forms of evidence and having constraints on the ability to do conclusive, decisive, randomized controlled trials puts us in a position where people can really bounce in and out at different levels of this chain of research and cause a great deal of confusion in some cases. And even in the rare instance that you have a super tightly controlled, randomized controlled trial in nutrition, people will still really hammer it in terms of the methods applied. So like I said, foreshadowing, the 1st of March, I've got a paper coming out, or in a review of a paper in the Mass Research Review that basically Kevin Hall at the NIH did you can't do more tightly controlled nutrition studies than metabolic ward studies. So very tightly controlled crossover trial where each participant served as their own control. And it basically said, hey, we had these two diets. One caused a bunch of insulin release. The other didn't. People actually ate less on the high carb diet that caused a lot of insulin release. And in my article, I recap a series of, I think, 4 or 5 papers that resulted from this back and forth of which is true, the carb insulin model or the energy balance model. And it's a funny little tale because you go back and forth. And like I said, there's people diving in at all different levels, basic research, observational research, controlled trials, nitpicking this trial by Kevin Hall and colleagues. And Omar, would you believe me if I told you that after you get through all the nuance about carryover effects and crossover trial design and all these different adjustments and all these different biomarkers, what if I told you that there were 0 individuals who ate fewer calories on the high-fat diet than the high-carb diet? What if I told you that that was the data for which we're having this giant protracted 5-paper back and forth about whether or not people ate less on the low-carb diet?
I'd say this might be your Punisher moment. Eric had his a little bit ago, but this is sounding like yours on March 1st.
Yeah. So anyway, and by the way, I eat a relatively low-carb diet sometimes. It's fine. I think it's nice. But anyway, the broader point is it's important to look at some of these instances of people going back and forth and utilizing different forms of research with different interpretations to kind of build these arguments, because even if you don't care about this argument of energy balance model versus carbohydrate insulin model, it's a really good example that you can use as a learning tool and say, okay, what does it look like when there is not that perfect randomized controlled trial that everyone agrees on? What does it look like when people are pulling from different areas of this chain of research and kind of cobbling together these different arguments? And how do I kind of assess which argument has more validity than the other? So, the research chain, unfortunately, sometimes we don't get those perfect studies that skip all the way to the end of it, or the kind of most generalizable ones. And when we need to rely, for a variety of reasons, on studies that have less translatability or ecological validity, that's where we have to do our best with the research available. And unsurprisingly, those are the areas where we have these huge debates that rage on and on and on.
Now, Trex, Helms, there's a reason why this is a monster episode. Helms, give me a high five, man. Over, down on the couch. Smack. They heard it. It was there.
Smack.
Hey, Trex, go ahead. Give us a high five, man. I know Zen Magic's going on, but give us a high five.
I already did the thing.
You did the thing.
Yeah, you think that was all 3 of us.
Hey, man. Yeah. So Trex is in I have right here. There's you want to know, so Helms is to the left of me. Trex is right behind this door right here with that Zen Magic baby. I was going to say that that perhaps is a much better way to phrase this. Like, what concessions sometimes do we have to make in the research chain? Only because it was brought up before, and this is maybe just the last point, but like the meta-analysis where it should be maybe theoretically at the tippity top, but depending upon how, if it's only one meta-analysis, how it's conducted, how it could raise more questions. And when we had that conversation 2 days ago about some of that translational research and really like how it was not jiving at all with any of the mechanistic stuff, one would weigh on that far more heavily. But when that might not necessarily be the case, it really does seem, unfortunately, as you're saying, Helms, like with not throwing shade at Todd. I mean, that doesn't really matter, honestly. But misapplied basic research, how it could really just spiral out of control. And so I think that was fantastic from both of you, just putting in the general context of why that tends to happen, why, if in any scenario, one would kind of not change the order, but the weight of what one kind of evaluates a certain type of evidence. Is there anything, Helms, you want to say kind of in conclusion to really wrap this up?
I think we covered a lot of ground. I think moving as far up the evidence hierarchy as you can to make decisions is ideal, but you can get in trouble if you don't understand the limitations of it. So if your ability to access and interpret with confidence a meta-analysis is not there, or the meta-analysis doesn't exist, you've got to probably kind of shift laterally and go, right, let me find a good position stand. Let me find a good systematic review. And if that doesn't exist, then it probably makes sense to take a look at some of the science communication platforms out there that have the right reward mechanisms behind them, which is providing useful information. Shameless self-plug. Like, what is the mass team's take on it? What is Weightology's take on it? What is RP's take on it? And what is, if it's nutrition, maybe Alan Aragon's take on it? And, look at all of those. And if there is still not yet consensus, hey, it's okay to be comfortable not knowing yet and understanding this is an emerging field, right? And it's typically only going to be things that are nuanced or relatively newly researched topics that are not fundamental to what we're doing. Because clearly, bodybuilders that were jacked before they started reading research studies. People were strong before they started reading research studies. So it's not like the barrier to your success is probably going to lie in one of these currently debated topics. And then as you move up that research chain, also understanding that a meta-analysis of, let's say, blood pressure responses is not the same thing as a meta-analysis of epidemiological studies looking at all-cause mortality, which is not the same as a randomized controlled trial of something for 8 weeks. So understanding where the hierarchy of evidence intersects and integrates with this chain of research helps you evaluate claims and get an idea of consensus on a topic. And there's a lot out there, and it can be quite challenging. But I think if you have these two potentially overlapping lenses and you understand their limitations, the likelihood of you getting it wrong goes down substantially. And you know what? I know not every consumer is willing to do this, but I also know that we have a lot of trainers and we have a lot of content producers who listen to Iron Culture. So what my hope is that even if this may be not changing the practice of someone who is going to go train on Tuesday, but someone who might make an Instagram post on Tuesday for all the clients they have or all the trainers who come to them for informational purposes, that this will hopefully help you put out information that is more useful. And we can, giving another big shout out to capitalism, we can have a trickle down effect on the information, but hopefully maybe more effectively than that seemed to play out in the real world on the way people learn things. And that's my sincere hope. And there's more to talk about on this topic. I'm sure we could have another episode. I would love to talk about models, as that seems to be something that is really big among certain circles. Like, hey, let's understand the mechanism. Let's create a model of training based upon that, and then we'll take that right to the real world, which is kind of subverting that chain. And, there's many different types of models, but one of the key things on the last step of the models that are intended to actually change practice is actually making sure the model fits the real world observations and fitting the model to the data. And that's not the step that I'm often seen taken, but it is a necessary step if that is a model of the type of model which is meant to inform practice. So I will leave that there as a teaser for maybe next time. But that's all I have to say. How about you, Trex?
Yeah, I wanted to add one thing, because I think when discussing this research chain, I think up to this point, I presented it in a sense, kind of reflecting a bias almost that, well, obviously the best thing is a randomized controlled trial and, a kind of translatable intervention study. But I do want to add one more wrinkle and kind of finalize that argument by mentioning that it is a chain. And while certain types of evidence give us certain types of information and some might be more generalizable in some cases, the mechanistic stuff still matters in a big way. And there are some cases where you might actually say, I understand that the randomized controlled trial has been done, but I actually think we need to go back to the basic stuff when it comes to how we interpret it. So for example, just to put a really clear example to it, metabolic adaptation, Helms. This is something you and I go back and forth about a lot. There were a couple randomized controlled trials recently where people said, hey, diet breaks and refeeds, the idea that these are going to reduce metabolic adaptation, they're debunked, right? Because we just did a couple studies in, relatively fit people, randomized them. Some folks are doing, refeeds and diet breaks. Some people are just doing the normal thing. And we didn't see a difference in resting metabolic rate, right? So clearly we're not attenuating metabolic adaptation because we're not seeing these differences in energy expenditure when we compare these different strategies to just a control kind of normal diet. And that was an area where people, if we were just going at face value and saying randomized controlled trials are the best, and therefore, this is the most ecologically valid model, metabolic adaptation is going to happen no matter what, and refeeds and diet breaks don't work at all. Well, the challenge with some of those RCTs is that they were done in folks who weren't, they were athletic, but they were not like shredded, and they did not lose substantial amounts of weight in the study, right? So you had to go back to the mechanistic research and say, well, wait a minute. If we were doing refeeds and diet breaks to attenuate metabolic adaptation, but we were not creating the conditions in the randomized controlled trial that would theoretically lead to a meaningful amount of metabolic adaptation, then this null finding, this lack of benefit in the randomized controlled trial may not actually answer the question in the way that some folks are interpreting it, right? So that would be an example where it's not that you're putting basic findings over longitudinal kind of controlled trial findings, but it is a scenario where you are contextualizing the findings of that applied research and saying, okay, there's useful information we can get from those studies, but I'm not sure if they're actually the right way to answer the question. It might be the right approach. Maybe we can do an RCT to address the question, but these particular RCTs, because of the mechanistic research, they're not actually disproving what some folks are saying they're disproving, or they're not contradicting what some folks are kind of claiming. So that all of that is to say, these different forms of research, it's not about better or worse. It's about how they interact and help us contextualize one another. And without going on any additional tangents, I will yield the remainder of my time.
It's an excellent point. The chain goes two ways, because if you have an applied study without understanding the mechanism underlying it, often you'll get lateral applications in practice. So, for example, if you think lengthened partials are really, really effective because they're the stretch at the longest length, then maybe you're thinking that, therefore static stretching is just as effective. Maybe not. If we don't understand the actual mechanism of why in this study they lost more weight on a low carb diet, you can apply some idea about insulin. We'll just take what's already happened and go, instead of understanding it was water weight and glycogen loss and sodium losses leading to water losses, we go, okay, so therefore this thing we know about insulin is true. I want you to eat a low protein diet with a low content of branched chain amino acids and leucine, because I don't want insulin to come up, and that'll be better for body composition. So in the absence of understanding the mechanism, lateral applications can leave you astray. So it really does need to be a cohesive chain. That's well said, Eric.
Helms, would you say that, you said it goes both ways, would you say it's a two-way street?
I would.
Okay, cool.
I would indeed.
Yeah, and I was going to say, folks, the headline here is that the mechanistic stuff, mice, a whole lot of ablation is still going to be going on. They just cannot be saved. It was brought forth on this episode, but it was decided, unfortunately, it's not the case. That's what, Trex, final point I'll say. One of the things you said, you can't, as an example with the randomized control trials for smoking or whatever the case, you brought up teenagers and something with measuring mice. I'm there's not going to be a severing of any muscles amongst the teenagers. You can't do any of these things. But unfortunately for the mice, once again, I forget what episode it was, Helms, but it was, and someone went into details. But anyways, that is this episode. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of Iron Culture. You could go ahead and leave a rating and review. I want to give a shout out to that person that gave the 1 star, saying it was too verbose. This episode's for you. It's on Apple iTunes. It's not because we want to, we're not beholden, okay? We talked about consumerism to Apple iTunes. It's just that they bring forth all the reviews. They sorted it. It's an easy way for us. You can go ahead and leave a review on the YouTube comment section, okay? 5 stars is typically what people leave. 5 stars may not be good enough at this point because inflation on reviews, it's real. 5 stars is basically a 1 star review at this point. But we're back every single insert date here from now until the end of time. So we'll catch you in that next episode.